In the marble atrium of a luxury shopping complex in Boston, Charlotte Bennett seized the arm of a quiet single father wearing dusty work overalls, loudly declaring that her limited edition Rolex had vanished the instant he walked past her display. A crowd formed within seconds, phones rising in unison, every lens aimed squarely at the quiet man now accused of theft in front of strangers. Logan Carter did not flinch or argue. He simply reached into his overalls pocket and withdrew a small case, revealing a Patek Philippe worth $5 million, and the entire atrium fell utterly silent. If stories about quiet justice and unexpected redemption move you, follow along for many more emotional journeys like this one. Logan Carter arrived at the Prescott Commons shopping complex before dawn, the way he always did, moving through the service corridors with the quiet efficiency of a man who preferred to be forgotten. He wore the same faded blue overalls every single day, patched at one knee, the name tag on the chest worn nearly smooth from years of handling. To the hundreds of employees who worked across the glittering storefronts of Prescott Commons, he was simply the maintenance technician who fixed the air conditioning, patched the leaking pipes behind the bakery, and always seemed to know exactly which fuse had blown before anyone else could diagnose it. Nobody at Prescott Commons knew his real story. Nobody knew that the man replacing a flickering light fixture outside the coffee counter had once sat at the head of a boardroom table, directing decisions that moved hundreds of millions of dollars. Logan preferred it that way. Ever since his wife passed away, he had walked quietly out of that world, choosing instead the plain rhythms of ordinary work and the steady, uncomplicated love of raising his son alone. He answered to no title now except father, and that was the only title he wanted. The security guards liked him because he never complained about odd hours. The barista at the corner shop liked him because he always tipped generously despite his humble uniform. The elderly cleaning staff liked him because he remembered their names, their grandchildren, their aching knees, and always found 5 minutes to carry something heavy so they would not have to. Logan moved through Prescott Commons like a quiet current beneath a loud river, present everywhere, noticed by almost no one. That particular morning, the entire complex buzzed with an energy Logan had never seen before. Bennett Company Jewelry, the crown jewel retailer anchoring the West Wing, was preparing to unveil its most anticipated collection in a decade, a curated set of rare limited edition timepieces, each one insured for a figure that made security personnel nervous just discussing it. Velvet ropes lined the marble floor. Photographers adjusted tripods. Reporters from finance publications murmured into recorders while sipping champagne poured far too early in the day. At the center of it all stood Charlotte Bennett, 31 years old and already the chief executive of the family empire her grandfather had built decades earlier. Charlotte possessed the kind of polished confidence that came from being told her entire life that her instincts were exceptional. She trusted her gut the way other executives trusted spreadsheets, and so far that instinct had rarely failed her in business. She wore a cream-colored suit that morning, her hair pulled back with surgical precision, every gesture calculated for the cameras trained on her storefront. Beside her stood Jessica Moore, the store manager, 29 years old, eager in the particular way of someone who had learned that flattering the right people opened doors faster than competence ever could. Jessica had spent the entire week rehearsing her lines for the unveiling, positioning herself close enough to Charlotte that photographs would inevitably include her too. She smiled constantly, laughed at every joke Charlotte made, and kept one eye permanently fixed on opportunities to prove her value. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been sharper. On one side of the atrium, diamonds and gold gleamed beneath museum-grade lighting, guarded by velvet ropes and armed security. On the other side, Logan knelt near an access panel behind a decorative column, checking a temperature reading on the climate control system that fed cool air into the display cases. He had been asked that morning to ensure the humidity levels stayed perfectly calibrated for the unveiling, since certain vintage movements inside those watches were sensitive to even slight fluctuations. He worked without hurry, adjusting a valve, noting numbers on a small clipboard, entirely unaware that his ordinary Tuesday was about to collide with the most extraordinary morning of Charlotte Bennett's professional life. Logan finished his inspection, closed the access panel, and began walking the long way around the display floor toward the loading dock, passing directly behind the roped-off section where the rarest watch in the collection sat gleaming under glass, waiting for its unveiling in less than 1 hour. The unveiling was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and Charlotte had walked the display floor perhaps a dozen times already, checking angles, checking lighting, checking that every watch sat exactly where it belonged inside its case. When she reached the far end of the display, her heart dropped into her stomach. The case that had held the crown piece of the entire collection, a limited edition Rolex reserved for only a handful of collectors worldwide, stood empty. The velvet cushion inside bore only the faint indentation where the watch had rested moments before. Charlotte's mind raced through possibilities, but none of them mattered as much as the simple, overwhelming fact that the watch was gone. Security had not yet reviewed the footage. No alarms had sounded, there was no obvious explanation, only an empty case and a woman whose entire morning, and quite possibly her professional reputation, now hinged on finding an answer within minutes rather than hours. Jessica arrived at her side within seconds, drawn by the sharp intake of breath Charlotte could not suppress. She glanced at the empty case, then scanned the surrounding area, and her eyes landed on Logan, who happened to be walking past the roped section at that exact moment, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the unfolding crisis behind him. "Him," Jessica said, her voice rising with sudden certainty, insisting that she had watched him walk right past the case herself. Charlotte turned, and something in her calculated, instinct-driven mind locked onto the image before her. A man in worn, dusty overalls, standing near a fortune in missing jewelry, looking entirely out of place among cream suits and diamond necklaces. She did not pause to consider that Logan had walked this route every single morning for years. She did not consider that dozens of other employees, contractors, and guests had also passed through the atrium that hour. She saw what her instinct told her to see, and her instinct had rarely been wrong before. "Stop him," Charlotte said, and the words carried across the marble floor with the force of command. Security guard David Brooks appeared almost instantly, trained to respond the moment his employer raised her voice. He approached Logan and asked him, politely at first, to step aside. Logan did not resist. He set down his clipboard, raised his hands slightly, and asked what the trouble was, his voice even and unhurried despite the sudden weight of attention now aimed directly at him. Charlotte strode toward him and, without waiting for confirmation of anything, gripped his forearm and declared to the gathering crowd that her limited edition Rolex had disappeared the instant this man walked past her display. The words landed like a spark on dry grass. Within seconds, a crowd formed, drawn by raised voices and the particular electricity that surrounds public conflict. Phones rose in the air, dozens of them, all angled toward Logan's face. David asked Logan to open the smallest bag he carried, the one containing his tools and his lunch. Logan complied without hesitation, unzipping the bag and stepping back so David could search it freely. Wrenches, a flashlight, a sandwich wrapped in paper, nothing resembling a stolen watch. Still, the crowd did not disperse. Several onlookers had already begun narrating the scene aloud for the benefit of whoever might be watching their live broadcasts, describing a dramatic theft unfolding in real time at one of Boston's most prestigious shopping destinations. Logan remained still through all of it, his expression unreadable, his posture calm in a way that struck several onlookers as strange for a man being accused so publicly. He did not raise his voice, he did not protest his innocence with dramatic gestures. He simply asked, in a low and steady tone, that the matter be handled through proper procedure rather than through accusation in front of a crowd. Charlotte, flushed with adrenaline and conviction, was in no mood to listen. The crowd pressed closer, and somewhere in the middle of the noise, a new voice called for calm. It belonged to Gabriel Foster, 67 years old, a horologist whose name carried weight in collector circles across 3 continents. He had been invited to the unveiling as a guest of honor, and he now pushed gently through the onlookers, drawn by the commotion he had not expected to witness on what was meant to be a celebratory morning. Logan, still surrounded, finally reached into the deep pocket of his overalls, the one usually reserved for a small notebook and a stub of pencil. He withdrew instead a small, weathered case, its leather softened by years of careful handling. He opened it without ceremony and held it up, not defensively but simply as a statement of fact. Inside sat a watch unlike anything most of the onlookers had ever seen in person, a Patek Philippe, its dial catching the overhead lighting in a way that seemed almost to still the air around it. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Charlotte, still gripped by adrenaline, insisted the watch was fake, a cheap imitation meant to distract from his guilt. Logan said nothing in response. He simply held the case steady and let it speak for itself, patient in a way that unsettled the very people who had been so quick to condemn him moments earlier. Gabriel stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, and asked quietly if he might examine the piece. Logan extended it toward him without a flicker of hesitation. Gabriel turned the watch gently in his fingers, studying the case back, the crown, the subtle engraving nearly invisible to an untrained eye. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to genuine astonishment within seconds. "This is not a reproduction," Gabriel said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent atrium. "This movement was hand-finished by a master watchmaker whose work rarely leaves private collections. I have seen perhaps 3 pieces like this in my entire career, and none of them were ever offered for public sale." Charlotte's certainty, so absolute only minutes before, began to waver. She stared at the timepiece resting in Gabriel's careful hands, then back at Logan, whose overalls were still smudged with the dust of his morning work. Nothing about the scene made sense to her, and the dissonance between the man's appearance and the object he now held created a silence more powerful than any accusation had been. Gabriel continued, almost to himself, calculating aloud the piece's likely value based on its rarity, its provenance, and the handful of similar timepieces that had sold at auction over the past decade. The number he arrived at exceeded $5 million, a figure that rippled through the crowd like a current, prompting gasps and a fresh wave of raised phones, though now aimed with a very different kind of curiosity. Jessica, who moments earlier had been so quick to point her finger, now stood frozen near the empty display case, her earlier confidence visibly cracking. She glanced toward the case, then toward Logan, then toward Charlotte, searching for some way to steer the conversation back toward the narrative she had constructed, but no words came. Onlookers who had been narrating a dramatic theft now found themselves narrating something entirely different. A wealthy executive publicly accusing an ordinary-looking maintenance worker, only to be confronted with evidence suggesting the man was anything but ordinary. Whispers spread through the crowd, questioning aloud how a man who owned something so extraordinarily rare could possibly need to steal a watch from anyone. The tide of public opinion, so decisively against Logan minutes earlier, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to turn. By early afternoon, word of the strange encounter at Prescott Commons had spread well beyond the shopping complex itself. Local reporters who had come to cover the unveiling of a rare watch collection found themselves instead chasing a far stranger story, a maintenance worker who apparently owned a timepiece worth more than most people's homes. Calls came into the Bennett and Company press office asking for a statement. Photographers loitered near the loading dock hoping for another glimpse of the man in the overalls. Logan wanted none of it. When a reporter approached him near the service entrance, microphone extended, he simply shook his head and asked to be left to finish his shift. He answered no questions about where the watch came from, how long he had owned it, or why a man doing maintenance work carried an object worth millions of dollars in his pocket. His silence, rather than settling the matter, only deepened the public fascination surrounding him. Charlotte, for her part, remained unconvinced that the situation had been resolved. Pride is a stubborn thing, and hers had taken a public blow in front of cameras, investors, and her own staff. She told herself that the presence of an expensive watch did not prove his innocence, that perhaps the timepiece had been acquired through means she did not yet understand, that perhaps this entire spectacle was some elaborate performance staged to embarrass her on the very day meant to showcase her family's legacy. Gabriel, however, could not stop thinking about what he had held in his hands that morning. He returned to his office that evening and pulled old catalogs, correspondence with fellow collectors, records of provenance stretching back decades. Watches of that particular caliber were not simply purchased. They were inherited, gifted, or won through relationships built over generations within an extraordinarily small circle of collectors and their families. Whoever owned that watch, Gabriel concluded, belonged to a world most people never glimpsed regardless of what he wore to work each morning. Meanwhile, inside the store, Jessica moved with unusual haste toward the security office, telling the technician on duty that she wanted to review the footage herself before anyone else did, citing her role as manager and her responsibility to understand exactly what had transpired. The technician, accustomed to deferring to store management, granted her access without much thought. Jessica spent nearly 20 minutes alone with the recordings before stepping away, offering no explanation for the delay and appearing notably more composed when she finally emerged. Nobody noticed the gap at first. Security footage from a high-traffic luxury retail environment produced hours of largely uneventful video each day, and reviewing it in full took time nobody had immediately available. But a few observant eyes, including a part-time technician who had briefly glimpsed the recording software running unusual commands, began to sense that something about the official timeline did not add up. One reporter tracked down a former colleague of Logan's from years earlier, a man who now managed a mid-sized investment office in Providence, hoping for a quote that might explain the mystery unfolding at Prescott Commons. The former colleague, guarded and clearly reluctant to say too much, confirmed only that Logan had once been extraordinarily respected in certain financial circles, and that anyone assuming he lacked resources was making a serious miscalculation. He declined to elaborate further, citing respect for Logan's privacy, and the reporter was left with more questions than answers, exactly the kind of unresolved thread that only deepened public curiosity rather than satisfying it. By evening, public chatter about the incident had grown into a genuine phenomenon. People debated who Logan truly was, speculating wildly about hidden inheritances, secret collector networks, and the peculiar dignity with which he had endured public accusation. Few of them, however, guessed anything close to the truth. Charlotte read some of these threads late that night, alone in her office, the euphoria of her long-anticipated unveiling replaced entirely by a gnawing unease she could not quite name, and beneath that unease, a small, uncomfortable question about whether her instincts, so trusted for so long, had failed her completely. David Brooks had spent nearly 20 years in security work, long enough to develop an instinct for when something did not sit right. The official version of events, that a maintenance worker had somehow stolen a watch in broad daylight, only to produce an entirely different, far more valuable watch when confronted, struck him as thin from the very beginning. He requested full access to the security archive, intending to review every camera angle from the hours surrounding the disappearance, not just the brief clip that had already been shown to Charlotte. What he found troubled him immediately. A block of footage covering nearly 8 minutes, taken from the camera positioned directly above the display case in question, had been corrupted, the file replaced with a truncated placeholder that bore none of the metadata consistent with the rest of the day's recordings. David had overseen enough system audits to know that corruption of this kind rarely happened by accident, and almost never happened to such a precisely relevant window of time. He approached Logan directly, this time without accusation, simply asking whether he would be willing to walk through his exact movements that morning, step by step, to help reconstruct an accurate timeline. Logan agreed without hesitation, offering details with the precision of a man who paid close attention to his surroundings out of long habit. He described the valve he had adjusted, the reading he had recorded, the exact moment he had passed behind the roped section, and the path he had taken toward the loading dock afterward. Charlotte, informed of the missing footage, felt the ground shift beneath her for the first time since the incident began. If evidence had genuinely been altered, her entire accusation rested on nothing but appearance and assumption, precisely the kind of judgment she prided herself on never making. She sat in on part of David's conversation with Logan, watching him answer questions with the same unhurried calm he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and something about that consistency began to erode her earlier certainty. During the conversation, Logan mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had once studied watchmaking in Switzerland years before he ever set foot in Boston. He offered no further explanation, no context about why a Swiss-trained horologist would spend his mornings repairing air conditioning units, and Charlotte did not press him for one, sensing instinctively that this was a door he was not yet ready to open. The detail nonetheless lodged itself in her mind, another piece of a puzzle whose full shape she could not yet see. Later that afternoon, an elderly cleaning employee named Rosa approached David quietly, saying she preferred not to make a scene but felt she ought to mention something she had seen earlier that day. She recalled watching Jessica enter the back storage room shortly before the unveiling, carrying nothing unusual, but emerging several minutes later, looking flustered and glancing around as though checking whether anyone had noticed her. Rosa had thought little of it at the time, assuming Jessica had simply been retrieving supplies, but after hearing about the missing footage, the memory had begun to feel significant. David thanked her and made a note, aware that a single observation from a cleaning employee proved nothing on its own but might, combined with the corrupt footage, begin forming the outline of a very different story than the one Charlotte had told so confidently that morning in front of a crowd of cameras and customers. That night, David stayed late at the security office, cross-referencing employee access logs against the timestamps surrounding the missing footage. He noticed that the storage room key assigned to Jessica had been used twice within a narrow window that morning, once at an hour that did not align with any task listed on her schedule. He said nothing yet to Charlotte, unwilling to raise an accusation against a colleague without firmer proof, but the discrepancy settled into his thinking the same way the corrupted footage had, a small irregularity refusing to be explained away by coincidence alone. What almost nobody at Prescott Commons knew, and what Logan had never spoken of to a single coworker, was that he had once co-founded a family investment fund that managed the fortunes of some of the wealthiest households on the eastern seaboard. He had built that fund alongside his father during his 20s, applying an analytical mind that had once earned him a reputation as one of the sharpest young minds in private wealth management. For years, his name had appeared quietly on documents that moved fortunes larger than most people could imagine, always working behind the scenes, never seeking the spotlight that so many of his peers have craved. Everything changed the year his wife died. She had been the one who grounded him, who reminded him that numbers on a page meant nothing without a life worth living alongside them. After she passed, Logan found himself unable to sit through another boardroom negotiation, unable to care about quarterly performance reports or shareholder expectations. He resigned from every position he held, transferred his responsibilities to trusted partners, and walked away from a world that suddenly felt hollow without her in it. He chose maintenance work at Prescott Commons not out of necessity, since his finances remained entirely secure, but because the work offered something his previous life never had. Quiet, tangible problems with clear solutions, and evenings free to raise his young son without the pull of urgent phone calls and demanding investors. He wore the same overalls every day because they reminded him of simplicity, of a life measured in fixed pipes and working fixtures rather than portfolio returns and quarterly earnings calls. The Patek Philippe had belonged to his father, a gift passed down the day Logan turned 30, accompanied by a letter explaining that the watch represented decades of careful stewardship, patience, and restraint, qualities his father hoped Logan would carry into whatever life he chose next. Logan had been offered extraordinary sums for the timepiece over the years, collectors and dealers occasionally recognizing its rarity and approaching him with staggering proposals. But he had never once considered selling it. It was not an asset to him. It was the last physical connection he had to a man who had taught him everything he knew about patience, discipline, and the quiet dignity of doing good work without needing anyone to notice. Charlotte learned pieces of this story slowly, through a conversation with David, through Gabriel's careful research into the watch's provenance, and through her own quiet observations of a man who bore public humiliation with a composure she had never seen before. The more she learned, the more uncomfortable she became with her own behavior that morning. She had looked at overalls and dust and drawn a conclusion within seconds, never once pausing to consider that appearance revealed almost nothing about the person wearing it. At home, Logan's evenings revolved entirely around his son, a quiet, curious boy who knew nothing of investment funds or rare watches, only that his father always arrived home in time for dinner and never missed a single school event no matter how demanding the day had been. Logan cooked simple meals, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and read aloud most nights until his son fell asleep, a routine he guarded more fiercely than he had ever guarded any business deal during his years running the fund. That devotion, more than any figure on a balance sheet, represented the life he had chosen when he walked away from his old world, and nothing about the public spectacle at Prescott Commons had shaken his commitment to it. Still, understanding Logan's past did not yet prove his innocence in the matter of the missing Rolex, and Charlotte found herself caught between a swelling sense of guilt and a lingering need for concrete evidence before she could bring herself to apologize publicly for what she had done. She needed the full truth, not merely a sympathetic backstory, and she suspected with growing unease that the truth was still hiding somewhere inside Prescott Commons, waiting to be uncovered. David worked through the night with a data recovery specialist he trusted from his years in corporate security, determined to reconstruct the corrupted footage rather than accept its loss as final. Deleted files, he knew, rarely vanished completely from a system. Fragments often lingered in unused storage space, waiting for someone patient enough to piece them back together. By early morning, the specialist had managed to recover roughly half of the missing 8 minutes, enough to reveal a sequence of events entirely different from anything Charlotte had assumed the previous day. The recovered footage showed Jessica approaching the display case nearly 10 minutes before the unveiling was scheduled to begin, well before Logan had ever walked through that section of the atrium. She glanced around briefly, then lifted the case's glass cover with a small key she should not have possessed, and removed the limited edition Rolex, replacing it briefly with an identical-looking case before closing the cover again. Her movements were quick, practiced, and unmistakably deliberate. David sat back from the screen, feeling the particular weight that comes with confirming a suspicion nobody wanted to be true. He continued reviewing what remained of the recovered files and found a second troubling detail. A brief exchange, captured by a hallway camera near the loading dock, between Jessica and an unfamiliar man in a delivery uniform who did not appear on any of that morning's scheduled shipment logs. The exchange lasted only seconds, just long enough for something small to pass between their hands. Further digging into the store's internal records revealed that Jessica had, over the preceding months, developed a pattern of unusual contact with several outside buyers known within the industry for handling rare timepieces through routes that avoided the scrutiny of legitimate auction houses. None of this had been noticed before, largely because nobody had reason to suspect the store's own manager of orchestrating theft against the very company she worked for. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself. Jessica had planned to steal the Rolex during the chaos of the unveiling, using the general commotion as cover, and needed a convincing distraction to draw attention away from herself in the crucial moments immediately following the theft. Logan, dressed plainly and walking through the area at precisely the wrong moment, had provided exactly the distraction she needed, an innocent bystander transformed instantly into a convenient suspect. David brought the recovered footage and his findings directly to Charlotte the following morning, laying out the sequence of events with the same measured precision Logan had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Charlotte watched the recovered clips in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to something colder and more focused as the truth settled fully into place. The woman she had trusted to manage her flagship store, the same woman who had pointed her finger at an innocent man in front of a crowd of witnesses, had orchestrated the entire theft herself. Charlotte closed her laptop slowly and sat for a long moment without speaking. She thought of Logan's calm expression as accusations rained down on him, of his patient insistence on proper procedure, of his silence in the face of humiliation that would have provoked outrage in almost anyone else. She thought, too, of her own certainty, so quickly formed and so completely wrong, and she understood that setting things right would require far more than a simple private apology. Samuel Reed, chairman of the board at Bennett & Company, called an emergency meeting the moment Charlotte briefed him on David's findings. Samuel had guided the company through decades of careful growth, and he understood immediately that the situation now extended far beyond a single missing watch. A false public accusation captured on dozens of phones and circulating widely online represented a threat to the company's reputation that no amount of quiet internal correction could fully repair. The truth needed to come out clearly, and it needed to come out soon. Jessica was summoned to the boardroom that afternoon, unaware of exactly how much evidence had already been assembled against her. She arrived composed, prepared to offer some explanation for the missing footage, but her composure did not survive the meeting's opening minutes. David played the recovered clips without preamble, the footage of her lifting the case, replacing the watch, exchanging something with an unfamiliar man near the loading dock. Jessica's face drained of color as the room watched the sequence unfold in silence. She attempted at first to offer explanations, suggesting the footage had been misinterpreted, that she had simply been checking the display for security purposes, but the internal records David had gathered, showing months of contact with outside buyers, left little room for doubt. Confronted with the full weight of evidence, Jessica's composure finally broke entirely, and she admitted in halting sentences that she had planned to sell the watch quietly through a contact who dealt in rare pieces outside conventional markets, using the unveiling's chaos as cover and Logan's presence as a convenient distraction. Charlotte listened to the confession with an expression that shifted from anger toward Jessica into something heavier and more personal. The recognition that her own instinct, so celebrated throughout her career, had led her to publicly humiliate an innocent man while the actual culprit stood calmly at her side offering reassurance. She excused herself briefly from the room, composed herself, and returned with a decision already forming in her mind. That evening, Charlotte arranged for Logan to be present at Prescott Commons, though she gave him no specific reason for the request, uncertain whether he would even agree to return after everything he had endured. He arrived in the same overalls he always wore, unhurried, betraying no particular anticipation about what awaited him. Charlotte met him near the very display case where the accusation had begun, and in front of Samuel, David, and several members of the store staff who had witnessed the original incident, she offered a full and public apology. She acknowledged, without qualification, that she had judged him based entirely on his appearance, that she had ignored his calm insistence on proper procedure, and that her own pride had made the situation immeasurably worse for a man who had done nothing wrong. She stated plainly that Jessica, not Logan, had orchestrated the theft, and that the company would be taking full responsibility for the harm caused by its own employee and by her own hasty judgment. Logan listened without interrupting, his expression softening slightly as Charlotte spoke, though he offered no dramatic response, no demand for punishment beyond what the situation clearly required. He simply asked, quietly, that his dignity be restored in the same public manner it had been questioned, nothing more elaborate than that. Word of the apology, along with a brief clip Samuel authorized for release, spread quickly through the same networks that had condemned Logan only 2 days earlier, and the public reaction, this time, tilted overwhelmingly in his favor. Samuel Reed had said little during the meeting, but something about Logan's name had lingered in the back of his mind since the moment David first mentioned it during the investigation briefing. That evening, alone in his office, Samuel pulled old financial records from a locked cabinet he rarely opened anymore, documents relating to a period roughly 15 years earlier when Bennett and Company had faced a liquidity crisis severe enough to threaten the entire business. The family had come dangerously close to losing everything their grandfather built, saved at the last moment by an infusion of capital arranged through a private investment fund willing to take a significant risk on a struggling luxury retailer. Samuel found the name attached to that arrangement buried in a footnote of an old contract. Carter Family Holdings, the very fund Logan had co-founded and led during his years before stepping away from that world entirely. Samuel sat back in his chair, stunned by the realization settling over him. The unremarkable maintenance worker who had been publicly humiliated in his own store 2 days earlier was, in fact, the very man whose financial judgment had once rescued Bennett and Company from collapse, quietly and without any public credit sought at the time. Samuel brought this discovery to Charlotte the following morning, watching her expression shift from confusion to disbelief as he explained the connection. Logan, it turned out, still held a substantial position in Bennett and Company through a trust established during that original rescue agreement, a stake significant enough that he retained meaningful influence over the very company that had accused him of theft, though he had never once exercised that influence, never appeared at a shareholder meeting, never made his identity known to anyone within the organization's current leadership. Charlotte absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind alongside everything else she had learned about Logan over the preceding days. Here was a man who could have leveraged his position to demand concessions, compensation, or even influence over her own role as chief executive, and yet he had done nothing of the sort. He had endured public accusation with quiet dignity, requested nothing beyond a public apology, and returned to his maintenance work without a single mention of the power he held. The realization struck Charlotte with unexpected force. She had spent her career believing that confidence and visible authority were the truest signs of someone's worth, that decisive instinct mattered more than patient restraint. Logan's example suggested something entirely different, that genuine strength sometimes wore overalls, spoke rarely, and chose humility even when circumstances would have justified an entirely different response. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, questioning not just her judgment about a single incident, but the very framework she had used to evaluate people throughout her entire life. She asked Samuel whether Logan's stake in the company might complicate matters going forward, whether his sudden visibility might invite scrutiny from other shareholders or investors. Samuel shook his head slowly, explaining that Logan had never once, in 15 years, requested a report, attended a meeting, or asserted a single right attached to his holdings. Whatever he wanted from the world, it clearly was not power, recognition, or leverage over the people who had once needed his help and now, entirely unknowingly, needed it again. Samuel found himself thinking, more than once that week, about the kind of restraint such a position required. Most people who held meaningful influence over a company found ways, however subtle, to make that influence known, whether through a quiet word in the right meeting or a favor called in at a convenient moment. Logan had done none of this, not even when it might have spared him a morning of public humiliation. Samuel had spent decades in corporate governance and had rarely, if ever, encountered someone who held genuine power so lightly, and the realization left him with a quiet, unspoken respect he did not often extend to anyone so easily. Charlotte decided that a private apology, however sincere, would never be enough to repair the harm done to Logan in full view of a crowd and countless cameras. She organized a public gathering at Prescott Commons the following week, inviting employees, journalists, and members of the community who had witnessed the original incident, determined to reverse publicly what she had wrongly set in motion. Standing before the same atrium where the accusation had first unfolded, she spoke without notes, describing in plain terms how her own assumptions had failed a good man and how the company intended to make things right. She offered Logan a substantial financial settlement, along with a formal position within the company should he ever wish to use his expertise. Gestures she believed matched the severity of what he had endured. Logan declined both offers without hesitation, his voice calm as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. He explained that money could not undo public humiliation, and that a title meant nothing to a man who had spent years deliberately avoiding exactly that kind of recognition. What he asked for instead surprised nearly everyone present. He requested that Bennett and Company overhaul the way it handled accusations against both customers and staff, implementing a clear procedure requiring evidence and proper verification before any public confrontation could occur, protecting future employees and visitors from the kind of instant, unverified judgment that had nearly ruined his reputation over a watch he had never touched. Charlotte agreed immediately, and Samuel confirmed that the board would formalize the new procedure within the month. Several employees who had witnessed the original accusation approached Logan afterward, offering quiet apologies of their own for having filmed the confrontation without ever questioning its fairness. Logan accepted each apology with the same even grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, telling more than one of them that he understood how quickly a crowd could be swept along by a single confident voice, and that he held no lasting resentment toward anyone who had simply reacted the way most people would in the same circumstances. Gabriel Foster, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, spoke briefly as well, praising not merely Logan's remarkable watch collection, but the character he had displayed throughout an ordeal that would have broken the composure of most people. He noted that true worth, in watches as in people, revealed itself not through appearance but through the quality hidden beneath the surface, often invisible until circumstances forced it into view. His words drew a long, genuine round of applause from the assembled crowd, employees and strangers alike, rising to their feet in recognition of a man who had asked for nothing and deserved so much. Logan stood through the applause with the same quiet composure that had carried him through every difficult moment of the preceding week, offering only a small nod of acknowledgement before excusing himself from the gathering entirely. He had no interest in prolonged attention, no desire to bask in vindication for longer than necessary. Within the hour, he had returned to his usual overalls and his usual tools, checking a reported issue with a faulty thermostat near the east wing, precisely as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Charlotte watched him go, struck by the strange humility of a man who could have leveraged an entire company's guilt into whatever he wanted, and instead simply returned to fixing broken things for people who barely knew his name. She realized, standing alone in the atrium after the crowd dispersed, that something in her own understanding of value, of worth, of the difference between appearance and substance, had shifted permanently that week, in ways she suspected would outlast the incident itself by many years. In the months that followed, Bennett and Company implemented sweeping changes to its security and personnel procedures, establishing clear protocols that required verified evidence before any accusation could be made against a customer or an employee. Jessica faced formal legal consequences for her role in the theft, her carefully built reputation collapsing entirely once the full extent of her actions became public knowledge. The outside buyer who had briefly received the stolen Rolex was identified through the recovered footage and cooperated with authorities once faced with the certainty of his own exposure, allowing the watch to be recovered and returned to its rightful case within Bennett and Company's collection. Charlotte changed as well, in ways that extended well beyond the specific policies she authorized. She began asking questions before forming conclusions, gathering evidence before trusting her instinct alone, and reminding herself in quiet moments of the ordinary-looking man in overalls whose composure had exposed the limits of her own judgment. She visited Prescott Commons often in the weeks that followed, not merely to oversee her business, but to observe, in small ways, how differently she now looked at the people working quietly around her. Logan continued his simple routine largely unchanged, arriving before dawn, fixing what needed fixing, and returning home each evening to raise his son with the same steady devotion he had shown for years. He turned down every subsequent offer of recognition, every attempt by the company to publicly celebrate him further, preferring instead the quiet satisfaction of work done well and a life lived without unnecessary attention. The Patek Philippe remained exactly where it always had, tucked away safely, worn only occasionally, a private reminder of his father's patience rather than a public symbol of wealth. The story of that morning became something of a quiet legend among the employees of Prescott Commons, retold not as a tale of scandal, but as a lesson about the danger of judging people by what they wore rather than who they truly were. Visitors who later heard the story from staff members often glanced twice at the maintenance workers passing through the halls, wondering if only briefly what unseen depths might lie behind an ordinary uniform. As for Charlotte and Logan, something quiet began to grow between them in the months that followed, built slowly and deliberately from mutual respect rather than any grand gesture. She would occasionally find him near the loading dock during her visits, and their conversations, brief at first, gradually extended into longer exchanges about watches, about loss, about the strange, humbling lessons Boston had taught them both that week. Neither rushed toward anything more than friendship, understanding instinctively that whatever might eventually grow between them deserved patience rather than haste. Gabriel remained a frequent visitor to Prescott Commons in the following year, occasionally stopping by simply to speak with Logan about watches, about craftsmanship, about the quiet philosophy of patience that seemed to guide everything Logan did, both in his work and in his life outside it. He often remarked to colleagues afterward that meeting Logan had reminded him why he had devoted his entire career to studying objects built to last generations, since the man who owned the finest piece he had encountered in years cared so little for what it represented to anyone else. The story closed, as it had begun, in the same marble atrium where a false accusation once threatened to define a good man unfairly. This time, however, Logan walked through those halls at the end of his shift to nods of respect rather than suspicion, greeted by the very people who had once doubted him, each of them carrying forward a small, permanent reminder that true worth rarely announces itself, and that the quietest people in any room often carry the deepest stories, waiting patiently to be understood. If this story of quiet dignity and hard-won justice touched you, follow along for more tales of ordinary people revealing extraordinary character when it matters most.